Hello again. In this video, we're finally going to get into editing, and I'm going to show you how to edit your raw files. In other words, we're going to be able to go from this to this. Now, two things before we really get deep into editing. Number one, this can be done in either in Photoshop or Lightroom, and now obviously you will get the best results if you shoot in RAW. Now, number two, all of these editing tips and tricks were taught to me by the Center of Aviation Photography, also called COAP, and that link can be found right here. Now, generally, my workflow is number one, I like to crop. Number two, set my white balance. Number three, convert to black and white. Number four, set my exposure. Number five, get rid of the dust spots. And number six, either content aware fill out or clone stamp out any ramp clutter. And don't worry, we'll get in with how to do all that stuff. So let's get into Photoshop.
All right, so here we are in Adobe Photoshop. And obviously, as you can see, we have a nice F-18 shot that I took, I believe this was last summer at Mesa Gateway on a nice sort of monsoon rainy type day. We've got some real nice vapor trails coming off the wings here. We even have a little bit of nice heat haze coming out of the engine, which is a real rarity for both of those here in Phoenix, just because it's so hot and dry here, so we don't normally get vapor trails or nice heat waves like that where you can really see it. But this photo has a couple problems. First of all, the horizon isn't straight. Remember how we talked about not having straight horizons? The second problem is ramp clutter. Another thing that we talked about, this runway sign right here and maybe this light right here. We definitely want to get rid of that. The third problem is that it's overexposed. It's too bright. The sky's kind of washed out, and the jet, maybe we could probably darken that a little bit too. So let's go ahead and do that now. So the first thing that I always like to do when I'm editing is I like to crop my photos. So that's going to be done right up here. I'm going to click on that. And then I can change the aspect ratio of my photo. And remember how we talked about aspect ratios. So I can put this to 16 by 9. And of course, that's more of a panoramic, rectangular type crop. Or again, if we're posting this on, say, Instagram, Facebook, whatever, there's our 4 by 5 aspect ratio. But for now, let's just keep it in the original aspect ratio. So to crop my photo, I'm just going to drag these handles like this. And remember, I kind of want to leave a little bit of space in front of the nose here because we don't really want to be cropping like that. We want to give our jet some space to fly into. And even on this tail here, we probably don't want to crop that tight either because we want to keep these nice heat waves and vapor trails in there. So I'm going to move this down and maybe do that. Something like that maybe. All right, that looks pretty good. But that still doesn't solve our problem of the horizon not being straight. The easiest way to straighten the horizon automatically is to double click on this icon right here. And boom, there we go. We don't have to try and guess or drag things around. Photoshop will automatically straighten the horizon for me. All right, so let's go ahead and start making our adjustments. So I'm going to go in here and say edit. Okay, so the first thing that I like to do is I like to set my white balance. Now, generally on a bright sunny day in the middle of the day, your white balance is going to usually be around anywhere from about 54 to 5500 K. So that's this number right here. And just for showing, if I crank this slider all the way to the left, it's going to make it more blue. If I crank it more to the right, it's going to kind of make it more of a orangey yellow type color. And generally, if I was, say, shooting in the evening, I might want my white balance to be a little bit more warm. So I might want my white balance to be, say, 57 or 58 or maybe even 6,000. Versus if I'm shooting at night and I kind of want those nice, cool blue tones, I'm going to crank my white balance down and have my white balance be at something like maybe 52, maybe even 5,000 K. But obviously in this case, since I shot this in the middle of the day, I'm going to want my white balance to be at 5,500. So I'm just going to go ahead and type that in. Tint, I'm going to set to 0. I generally don't mess with that at all. And after I've done those two things, the next thing that I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to go down to here to where it says saturation and I'm going to want to type in -100. And that is going to give me a purely black and white image. Now, why would I do that? And this is another trick that CoAP taught me. In this case, you are now making adjustments and just trying to worry about getting your exposure right in the photo. You're not worried about white balance, you're not worried about color temperature, you're not worried about any of that stuff. You're just trying to get your exposure right. So let's go ahead and do that. And obviously, like I said at the top of this video, the sky is a little overexposed and the jet is a little bit too bright too. So let's crank down our exposure. All right, that's looking pretty good. And before I go any farther, I should also say that there is no secret recipe or preset for editing your photos. It's not like you can set your exposure to, say, -40 and your highlights to +20 and your blacks to -10 or whatever, and your photos will all turn out perfectly. No, it doesn't work that way. Every photo is going to be different. Again, there is no secret recipe or preset. You're going to have to mess around and maybe try a little bit of this, maybe a little bit of that, and maybe push my highlights up, bring my shadows down, whatever, just kind of until it just sort of looks good. And generally when I'm editing here, I like to start with my exposure and work down. So obviously once we've got our exposure how we want it, we can now set our contrast. So let's bring our contrast up again because the sky is kind of washed out and the jet is pretty bright too. So let's bring that up a little bit. My highlights in this case I probably don't want to touch because, again, of the brightness of the photo, but let's just adjust it just to see and see if that does anything. So let's push it all the way up here, doesn't do much. Push it all the way down, doesn't really do anything. So let's just set this back to 0. Now my shadows, I do know that I definitely want to adjust those. So I really kind of want to bring out some of those dark areas under the wing here and maybe on the wheels and the landing gear there. So let's kind of bring up the shadows. Okay. My whites, I'm going to want to probably bring down again because of how bright the sky is. So let's bring the whites down. And remember, a little goes a long way. Just a little bit, and it's going to get you definitely where you want to go. You don't want to necessarily push these sliders all the way to the right or all the way to the left. Now the black, same thing with my shadows, again, to kind of hit these dark areas right there. So let's bring those up a little bit. All right, that's looking pretty good. So once I've got these sliders how I want them, then I can go back into my saturation and set that back to 0. That's looking pretty good already. All right, so after we've got our exposure how we want it and all of these sliders basically with something that we're happy with, then we want to check for dust spots. Now this dust spots is really just, well, it's dust on your sensor. It doesn't cause any harm, but it will show up in your photo. And actually, I can even see we have a dust spot, a little one, right there above the tail. Now, whether that's a dust on the sensor, say a bird, a cloud, whatever, we don't want it in there. We want to get rid of it. So we're going to click on this little Band-Aid icon right here. And then I want to say visualize spots. And I can see there's a dust spot right there. So I'm going to want to click on that and it'll go away. And I can see there's another one right over here. So I'm going to want to click on that and it'll go away. Okay. And then we can go back into edit mode just so that way you can see. And boom, see, both those dust spots are now gone. Much better. Then we want to hit open. All right, so we've got our exposure how we want. We've got our dust spots taken care of. Now what do we need to do? We need to get rid of, we still have this big old ramp sign right here. So let's get rid of that. So there's two ways that you can get rid of this. The first way can be done through the clone stamp tool. That's this tool right here. Now, as it says, it paints with the pixels from another part of the image. So if I use the clone stamp, I could say select this area over here and paint over the runway sign. You can do that, but in this particular case, when the sign is pretty big, that's going to take me a while. If it was something smaller, say like a cone, or maybe even just a single light, yeah, I would want to use the clone stamp. But in this case, no. So instead, I'm going to want to use the Content Aware Fill tool. But first, we need to select that area so that way the Content Aware Fill tool can replace it. So to do that, I'm going to want to go in here where it says Quick Selection Tool, And I want to make sure that my cursor, which it already is set on this little icon right here where it's got the little plus sign like this. And then I can make this cursor bigger by tapping the right bracket on my keyboard. And then I can make it smaller by tapping the left bracket on my keyboard. So I'm going to go over this runway sign here, and I'm going to click and drag until it's selected. And then I'm going to want to go up into Edit and say Content Aware Fill. And the green areas are where Photoshop is sampling from to do the Content Aware Fill. But in this case, obviously, we don't want any of the jet, and we don't want any of this other part here. So to subtract those areas out, you'll see that my cursor now is this minus sign. So I'm just going to drag over those areas and get rid of them, like this. And again, I can make my bracket bigger by tapping the right bracket on my keyboard. And then I'm going to scroll down, and I probably want to make my cursor smaller, so left bracket on the keyboard. And again, dragging around just to really only select that area. And as you can see, I'm going to have to do a little bit of cleanup work in there, but it got most of it. So it'll look pretty good. So let's just hit OK, so that way it'll confirm the change. And I'm going to speed this up just so that way we can get rid of the runway sign. So I'll be back. All right, that's looking pretty good. The runway sign is gone. So now we can get into our layer masking. In other words, how we're going to be able to selectively adjust certain layers in our photo. Areas in our photo. In other words, how we're going to be able to turn down the exposure in our sky and how we're going to really be able to bring this jet out. And I'll do that in the next video, so stay tuned.